Hi, I'm Bailey. This is my podcast for PO393 at Boston University on the European Enlightenment. So today I'd like to talk about Descartes' Discourse on Method and its implications, and particularly relating to potential fallacies with his jump from deductive reasoning with cogito ergo sum, which means I think therefore I am. It's a very famous axiom in philosophy. His jump from this to inductive reasoning, and I would argue that he does this with his theory on the existence of God, and I'm going to employ some Kantian reasoning here to help me out. So after cogito, Descartes notes within himself the idea of a perfect being, and he argues that this couldn't have originated from himself because he himself is imperfect. So this idea must have a cause that's commensurate with its effect, and it implies a being greater than himself. So, using a form of the ontological argument, Descartes reasons that existence is a necessary attribute for a perfect being in this fashion. So, if God is defined as perfect, then God must exist. Now, this description of God as perfect is awfully convenient for Descartes, because he argues that God's existence ensures that the clear and distinct perceptions that he has are true, because this perfect God wouldn't deceive him. This bridges his subjective certainty to a more objective truth, and it provides his foundation for a reliable epistemological understanding of the world. So, without a further examination of this deductive reasoning, it would seem pretty justifiable that any inductive statements or examinations that Descartes makes from here on out would be reasonable because they're coming from a non-deceptive source. It's all predicated on God. And it is deductive in aspiration. But it really relies on a few leaps here, and now we have to turn to Kant to describe why these are fallacious. Kant's criticism can be found in the Critique of Pure Reason, and he argues that existence is not a predicate or a property that can add to the concept of something. Saying something exists does not change the characteristics that define it. So Kant uses an example of 100 thalers, which was a unit of currency back then, and he imagines whether or not he actually has 100 thalers, the concept of the 100 thalers does not change. Their existence or non-existence does not alter the properties of the thalers themselves. They're abstractly present nonetheless. So if existence is not a predicate, you just can't define something into existence by simply claiming that existence is one of its predicates. So you can't argue from the definition of God as necessarily existing to the conclusion that God exists in reality. So Kant's critique fundamentally challenges this logical structure of ontological arguments by separating the concept of a thing from its instantiation in reality. His argument suggests that existence must be demonstrated through experience and empirical evidence, rather than purely conceptual or logical means. So, ironically, we've come full circle here with Kant, and he's trying to justify the same thing as Descartes, which is that empiricism isn't disqualified, and that there is a place philosophically for inductive reasoning. Just Kant doesn't do it by theological means. So Kant differentiates between a priori knowledge, which is independent of experience. Deductive reasoning generally produces a priori knowledge, and a posteriori knowledge, which is dependent on experience and contingent on sensory data, and it's essential for pragmatically understanding the world. And Kant argues that without this empirical data, even the most rigorously logical deduction can't tell us anything new about the world. It can only clarify what we already conceptually know, a priori. Empirical methods are crucial for testing hypotheses and discovering these properties about the world that just aren't evident through deduction alone. So both deduction and induction have their own domains of effectiveness, and Kant emphasizes the importance of using each where they're most appropriate. Intuitively, all of this seems fine, so why bother bringing it up to begin with? Well, I would argue that everything else in this Enlightenment era is predicated on these ideas of deduction and induction. So, for example, all the theories about state of nature, these are all inductive and empirical claims. And yes, Locke and Rousseau and Hobbes each try to deduce some universal truths from, induced states and conditions, but fundamentally, they're all predicated on inductive observations and sensory experiences. And if there's any epistemological fragility here, then this calls into question all of our preconceived ideas and political theories. The point here isn't whether these theories have some utilitarian value, right? The problem here is whether they have epistemological certainty. And I would argue that they don't. They might be useful or pragmatic, and we might all have a passionate claim or allegiance to one of these political ideas that came out of the Enlightenment. But none of them are actual universal truths because they're all predicated on induction. And this is the case because Kant argues that synthetic judgments require empirical verification. And empiricism isn't based on fundamental deducible truths, but instead pragmatic engagement with the world to facilitate some value like well-being. Even the most epistemologically sound scientific theories remain compromised by Descartes' discourse on method. From this, we can see a kind of emergence of a philosophical framework, and it's somewhat of a gradiency of epistemological certainty, where at the beginning you have a high degree, or perhaps even the maximum degree of certainty epistemologically, and then there's some kind of drop-off that can degrade when it comes to induction. We've seen that even our most certain and trusted theories, like Newtonian gravity, have been vulnerable to this epistemological gradiency, and it fell out of favor for Einsteinian gravity and relativity. But who knows, maybe that's equally as vulnerable, and I would argue that it is definitely as vulnerable, and that could easily be replaced by something that seems more reproducible in the future. Meanwhile, things that can withstand Cartesian doubt, like mathematics, are invulnerable to this epistemological gradiency. 2 plus 2 equals 4 really always is true. And same goes for cogito. It really always is true. It just requires a conscious agent to engage with this deduction, just like mathematics. And the thing is that I personally really see no way out of this. The very best thing I've been able to think of that can justify some type of inductive reasoning in the same vein as discourse on method would be some type of premised philosophical theory like this. So premise 1 would be, my consciousness exists, and it must be contingent upon something rather than nothing. And premise 2 would be, this contingency implies a hierarchy or chain of dependencies, which is potentially reducible to a foundational or simplest something. And the final premise would be that perfect knowledge of this simplest something would grant a comprehensive understanding of the properties and operations arising from it. But again, this falls into the exact same trap of prioritizing induction, and not only that, but requiring induction, because I can't just sit here and deduce the most fundamental particle in the universe. Like, this is something that requires empirical study. And an even bigger problem here is that this assumption of a fundamental causal substrate undergirding cogito is equally as fallacious and inductive as anything after it. The only thing immune to Cartesian doubt in this framework I just proposed is that there's something rather than nothing. That is the only thing that's immune here. But maybe this type of induction that has reductionism as its primary ambition or sole ambition is at some kind of special status in this epistemological gradiency. And while maybe inductively it's not perfectly provable, it might give it some type of special legitimacy compared to other types of empirical research that aren't predicated on some type of foundational reductionist knowledge about the universe. Ultimately, the lesson here is that anything outside of the framework of Cartesian doubt and consistent with Hume's problem of induction, empirical claims just cannot have the same or comparable level of certainty to those of Cartesian origin, and there's a gaping hole in philosophy for it. Thank you.